A few months ago, I packed my fully electric e-Niro to the brim with clothes, a mattress, camping gear, camera gear, some extra battery banks, and even a 400-watt solar panel on the roof. And I set off from Melbourne to drive almost exactly 15,000 kilometres right around Australia, with my grandma joining me on the first leg from Melbourne to Perth. And I filmed the entire thing. You can go back and watch the entire journey if you haven't already. But I thought I should make one final video about it to sort of sum up how the entire experience went. I'm no stranger to EV road trips. I've done quite a few of them before this, but this was definitely the longest, and parts of it were in some of the most remote places I've ever been, so it had its challenges. And there's sort of so much that happened in those 22 days, it's kind of hard to really know where to start. But one of the main concerns most people have is probably the charging infrastructure, so maybe we'll start there. There are some gaps in the network and a few faulty chargers, and quite a lot of chargers that aren't as fast as I would like them to be, but mostly it's pretty good. From Melbourne to basically Ceduna, the charging was really pretty normal, just regular high-speed charging stations connected to the local grid. You just pull up, plug in, activate with a card or the app, depending on the station, and it just works. The further west we went, the less chargers we had to choose from, but we could still very comfortably make it from charger to charger and just keep on going like any normal EV road trip. Then, after Ceduna, we had the first stretch of highway with no power grid, so it got a bit more interesting there. There was a charger at Yalata Roadhouse. I think it was just running off the Roadhouse generator. It was way slower than it was supposed to be. It was meant to be a 50 kilowatt charger. I think we saw like 25 kilowatts or something, so really not ideal. But it gave us enough to make it to the Nullarbor Roadhouse, where they have the kind of flagship solar-powered charging station. There have been reports of this charger not working properly or running the backup generator when it really shouldn't be, but I had absolutely no issues. I fully charged the car at its max charging speed and the generator never came on. Then it was my first charge on the WA EV network. As a whole, I've actually really liked the WA EV network. They have a decent network of chargers all the way around the main highway in Western Australia, good speeds in towns with power grids, and honestly very cool solar battery diesel hybrid 50 kilowatt chargers for off-grid locations, sometimes also connected to the roadhouse and powering the roadhouse with mostly solar. So they're pretty cool setups there, and most of the time they've worked really quite well for me. But this first one was really not a good first experience. The screen was broken, and even after I managed to activate it, the speed was pretty slow, but it worked. And then from there to Norseman, the chargers were actually not built yet at the time. There's more of those off-grid WA EV network stations now, but at the time they weren't there yet. So we had to use the temporary cooking oil powered chargers, which are very loud and not super user-friendly. And one of them was actually broken, causing us to need an overnight charge from a powered site to make it. But at least they were there, and they've now all been replaced with those permanent WA EV network off-grid chargers, which in my experience mostly seem to work pretty well. And you just pull up, plug in, and tap your card like any other charging station. So that sort of makes the whole experience a lot more seamless. And throughout every charge I've done on them, even in the rain, I've never heard the backup generator kick on, so they must have really a pretty good battery system. But then from Norseman to Perth, while some of it was really still quite remote, there were enough towns with real power grids that it was pretty much back to normal like it was at the start of the trip. And this continued a bit north of Perth. Using almost exclusively WA EV network chargers, there were a few in places that were put in by other companies, but it was mostly WA EV network chargers, but they were on-grid ones, so they worked a bit better. Then there were a few more of these off-grid setups in a few gaps between some of the cities all the way up the coast. And further north, there are even a few stations that weren't at a roadhouse or anything, just a random charger on the side of the highway, so typically no amenities there. But I do really appreciate how they've made sure there's a good network to easily get from charger to charger, rather than just putting the occasional charger where it's convenient. They've put them wherever they needed to make it actually work really well, and that's really good. And one highlight that really stood out to me here around this area was, I think it was Prado Roadhouse. Objectively, as an EV driver, this was quite a bad charging experience. It was out the back in the caravan park with kind of weeds and spiderwebs all around it. And then there was a sign on the charger saying to go and ask at the roadhouse before charging. So I did, and the guy there was worried that it wouldn't work. In the end, it actually worked perfectly fine. I got a good charge at the 50 kilowatt max speed of the charger and moved on. But it was a little stressful for a moment and just didn't feel at all streamlined or anything. But the reason the guy at the counter was worried is because they're obviously way off grid there. And at the time, their one and only diesel generator was completely out of order. So the roadhouse at the time, again, was completely dependent on the EV charger's solar system for power. And he was just worried charging a car from that at the same time might overload it. So at first, he let me use the slow charger that's also built into that station. So I would have been there for a few hours just to get a little bit more to make it to the next charger. But in the end, he told me to just give it a try on the fast charger, so I did, and that ended up working perfectly fine. But that meant the charge was completely solar. And I just remember standing in the roadhouse looking around. It's like 40 degrees outside, but all the air cons were going in there, keeping it perfectly comfortable inside. All the lights were on, the computer systems were on, the hot food thing where they keep the pies, the commercial kitchen out the back, the fuel pumps, everything was just running like normal. And there were customers coming in and out just like normal. No one realized the entire place was, at the time, entirely dependent on solar, with not even a backup generator. They were planning to get the generator fixed. I assume it's fixed by now. And that probably is a good idea for now, as a backup system to fall back on. But as a bit of an energy nerd, I thought that was really cool to see, even if it did make for a slightly stressful morning. Unfortunately, heading east, kind of inland from Broome a bit, there were quite a few chargers that were pretty badly vandalized. Mostly they were still working, just kind of hanging on by a thread. And then one of them, the fast charger, was actually completely broken, and I had to spend about an hour on the slow charger just to add a few more percent to make it to the next working charger. It's pretty unfortunate that they get vandalized at all, but it seems to be something that just comes with the area. I remember noticing in one of the towns I was in where everything was vandalized, even the petrol pumps had these kind of steel cage things around them. So they really need to add some sort of better vandalism protection to the chargers there. Or failing that, they might just have to build a few more off-grid chargers outside of the towns where maybe they'll be less likely to be vandalized in the first place. But that's something that needs to be worked on a little bit there. But the most difficult charging of the whole trip was definitely in the Northern Territory. Once I crossed the border and no longer had the WA EV network to rely on, the NRMA has a few chargers up and down the Stuart Highway, but east to west there was really nothing. So I did have a few days where I could only do a few hundred kilometers before I had to stop for the night and then very slowly charged from powered campsites. And because the charging was so slow, I couldn't really keep up with the 130 kilometer an hour speed limits that you get in the NT. It was just dropping the efficiency too much, and then would have had to charge so much more on those slow charges to get enough power to make up for it. So it made more sense to just go a bit slower. But that is kind of something to remember. If there are caravan parks or roadhouses with powered sites, or basically any form of PowerPoint or something you can access every few hundred kilometers. You actually can drive an EV really anywhere, but if you don't have proper charging infrastructure, it is going to take a very long time. It was almost kind of nice to take it a bit slower, but I was doing this whole trip in really quite a short time frame, so I really would have liked to have covered more distance on those days. But it is already getting better. Since I did this trip, the tiny town of Timber Creek between Kununurra and Katherine now has a slow charger that would easily fill an EV overnight. So if you can time it right to end up in Timber Creek for the night anyway, that stretch would actually be perfectly fine now, and you could probably even cruise at the full 130 kilometers an hour speed for the entire stretch between Kununurra and Katherine if you do a full overnight charge on that charger. But ideally, we do need a DC fast charger in Timber Creek and chargers at Barclay Homestead and Camberwell across the border in Queensland, and that would make crossing those borders, doing the sort of east to west Northern Territory section, a lot easier, and basically no different to road tripping anywhere else. And for the part of the Stuart Highway I used, the network was actually quite okay. Darwin to Mataranka was frankly very good with the NRMA network. I think it's like 150 kilowatt speeds or something, multiple plugs at each station, seems pretty reliable, decent spacing between charging stations. I don't like their app, but it was fine. But then for my car, it was a long stretch to make it from the last NRMA charger in Mataranka down to Elliot, where there's then only a 25 kilowatt charger that could definitely use an upgrade, and maybe even one in between somewhere there. But then there is another NRMA charger at Three Ways Roadhouse, which worked very well, and then that's where I turned off. Then, after a very slow day of charging at a powered site, driving a few hundred kilometers, and then charging at a powered site again, I finally made it to Mount Isa. And then from Mount Isa to Townsville, there's really a similar sort of Queensland charging network. All of these chargers are on grid because there's plenty of towns through there, and they mostly worked very well for me. And there were plenty of them. I had no issues with range or anything. They were frankly closer than they needed to be together. But they are only 50 kilowatts, so not great speeds there. And then down the east coast, there are a lot of chargers from a lot of different companies, which was really great. But I did have to use a few old tritium chargers, and these gave me some problems at times. I would generally avoid these if you can easily enough, but they do mostly work well enough if you really have to use them. So down the east coast, the only real problems I faced were more so charger reliability and the charger actually working and performing as it was supposed to, and at times other people using chargers, being back in a place with lots of EVs. But distance between chargers there really wasn't much of an issue at all, or even a consideration. You just go next one to the next one to the next one, often skipping several chargers as you go. So you can kind of pick and choose, which is a lot better. But it would be nice if you knew every charger you rolled up to was just going to work really well and there wouldn't be a queue. The car itself really did great. It's a 2021 Kia Niro, so nothing fancy or high tech or anything, and it really is more of a city car, but it was super comfortable to drive for hours on end, and it's got all the good features for this, like adaptive cruise control and everything. It was just really nice. And all the cooling systems handled the extreme heat very well. For a fair bit of the trip, the temperatures throughout the middle of the day hovered around like the mid-40s, sitting in the blazing sun, so quite uncomfortably hot. And it was able to keep it perfectly comfortable inside the car and keep the battery cool enough to have decent performance, even with multiple fast chargers in a row. The fast charging performance is definitely not as good as some of the newer, more advanced cars out there. It gets its fastest charging speeds of around 70 to 75 kilowatts from pretty much 0% state of charge up until about 55% state of charge, and then it starts to slow down to about 50 kilowatts, and then the speed absolutely falls off a cliff at around 70%. So there definitely are a lot of cars out there that would charge faster than this, but in some of the more remote places, quite a few of the charging stations can only do a max speed of 50 kilowatts. So on those chargers, my car charged just as fast as any other car would on that station, up until about 70%. And I honestly didn't find the charging time to be much of a bother at all. There were like a handful of times, like maybe 4 or 5 or something, where I was kind of just sitting in the car, looking at the state of charge and like the time remaining to charge and going, okay, come on, I would like to leave now. But most of the time, like, I'm just driving charger to charger to charger. It's kind of nice to have a break. I'd like plug in, go to the toilet, eat stuff, buy food, whatever, sort stuff out in the car, do some work, check emails, just kind of sit around, go for a walk through town if it's somewhere scenic. I was able to use up the time very easily, and often I was more leaving because I went, oh, the car could get faster speeds at the next charger down the road, so I should unplug and move on, even though I would have very happily sat there for another 15 minutes or something, just doing other things in the car. So I really didn't mind the charging speeds at all. While it is something that took up quite a lot of time, all that charging, I really don't consider much of that time to have been time spent charging. It was really just time spent doing other things, and I really didn't mind most of it at all. But if I did have a car with slightly better charging performance or slightly longer range or something, that would have helped with a few of those times where I wanted to move on a bit quicker and could have made the trip just go slightly more smoothly. Range is another consideration and a fairly relevant thing for a trip like this. Once again, there are plenty of EVs with better range than mine, but for what this car is, its range is actually, I would say, fairly good. On local roads, it would get about 450 kilometers to a charge, which isn't class leading, but not too bad. But as EVs are less efficient at highway speeds, it's closer to about 350 kilometers on a full charge, and at times even a bit less in some of the extreme conditions I was driving through. But for the vast majority of the trip, this was still perfectly fine. Even on remote highways, charges are typically no further than 200 kilometers apart, roughly. But it did mean I often had to charge up higher in the battery, above 55%, which gave me worse speeds than I needed to get sometimes. So it'd have these slower charging speeds more often, at a time when a better car would likely already have enough range to make it to the next charger. But while not ideal, it really handled it all perfectly fine without any major issues. The efficiency was worse than I was expecting. It's normally quite an efficient car, doing about 14 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers on local roads, or about 17 to 18 at 110 on the highway. But the average for this trip was about 19 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. And I remember some days, and some stretches in particular, I think mostly through northern WA, where the efficiency was like 20 or 22. I think I even saw as high as 24 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers at times. So the range really took a hit there, and I had to spend more time charging to make up for that, and I had to pay more for electricity, obviously. There's a lot of things that probably went into this. As a lot of people have pointed out in the comments, the car was pretty fully loaded with all the stuff I brought, so weight might have played a factor. And I also had a solar panel stuck to the roof, which could have impacted the aerodynamics. It was very thin, and I tried to stick it down as flatly as I could so that it wouldn't, hopefully. So I don't think it would have too much of an impact, but it's possible. And I actually don't think either of those things were really having a super bad impact, because on some of the stretches, like the first day from Melbourne to Adelaide, the efficiency was really not too much worse than normal, even with the solar panel on the roof and a whole lot of stuff in the car, including my grandmother, who wasn't there for some of the times where it was the worst efficiency. So I think the more significant things were the heat, for sure. The aircon was working pretty hard, and a few times when the efficiency was really bad, I checked and I noticed the battery cooling was using some power as well to keep the battery at an okay temperature. I think it was the day I drove from Port Hedland to Broome, somewhere near like 80 Mile Beach or something. I saw it using about 1 kilowatt for the air conditioning, which is abnormally high, and 1 kilowatt for battery cooling as well. So it was continuously using about 2 kilowatts just for cooling things, which I was doing 110, but if we pretend I was doing 100 kilometers an hour, just to make the maths easier, that cooling usage would add basically 2 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers extra consumption to the efficiency. So that could definitely be having that impact there. That was the worst I saw it. Normally it wasn't anywhere near that bad, but I do think the extreme temperatures definitely played a part. And then there would be the winds. Again, not always, but especially in places like the Nullarbor or anywhere with sort of similar landscape to the Nullarbor, there are often some pretty strong winds. And if that wind is a headwind or even a side wind, that can definitely have an impact. A few people in the comments actually said I was kind of going the wrong direction. Apparently, if I'd gone counterclockwise around Australia instead of clockwise the way I did, I would have more often had tailwinds than headwinds, but anyway, this is the way I went. And two other possibly less significant factors. In the remote places, there's just not much traffic, so you're a lot less likely to be driving behind someone, having a vehicle in front of you, pushing the air out of the way. I would never sit right behind other vehicles, or I hardly ever am right behind another vehicle, so I'm not sure how much of a difference this would really make, but it's certainly possible. And someone in the comments also said the road surfaces on the super remote highways are often extra coarse or something, which could also have played a part, so that's possible as well. But I think it was mostly the heat and the winds and the high speed in the Northern Territory. And one last car-related thing about the roads. All the major highways are just sealed normal roads and mostly in pretty fine condition. So those are really all the roads you actually have to drive on to get to do a full lap and get right around Australia. But in the more remote places, a lot of the tourist attractions that you might want to turn off and visit are on dirt roads. My car does perfectly fine on a decent quality dirt road. Even if it's a bit rough and quite corrugated, you typically just have to cruise at about 80 k's an hour and it does all right. Much slower than that and it starts to get really bumpy. But in northern WA and all of the NT and a little bit of northwest Queensland, I did find there were a few places I tried to go that had dirt roads in just such poor condition. With the ground clearance of my car, I was like, I'm going to start hitting rocks and getting things up underneath and possibly damage the car or something. And it is a front wheel drive car, so there were a few times where I kind of turned back because I was scared of sinking the front wheels into mud and getting bogged. So there were maybe 3 or 4 times throughout the trip that it might have been nice to have had all-wheel drive and a bit more ground clearance to get through some of those much worse dirt roads, but mostly it was perfectly fine. Moving on to what was actually in the car, it was very loaded. I did have quite a bit of camera gear with me that most people typically wouldn't bring on a trip, and I was camping in the car for a lot of the trip with a mattress in the back. It was really quite a tight fit, but with the back seats folded down and the front seats pushed as far forward as they would go and then tilted upright, I was able to fit a regular single mattress in the back, and it was actually quite comfortable once I got in there. And once I hit the tropics, I left the car running all night, so I was able to have the air conditioning on which for me in the wet season was basically essential. In the wet season, which is when I was there, if I was in a petrol car or something that couldn't run the AC all night, I really think I would have had to stay in a motel every night or something. The humidity was just absolutely unbearable. Like I couldn't have slept in that. And normally when I did this, I would have the car plugged in at a very slow charger at a powered site. So power wasn't really a concern. A powered site is not fast enough to fully charge the car overnight. So running the aircon all night will essentially reduce the range that you'll wake up with the next morning if you plugged the car in the previous night with fairly low charge, but I think it was worth it. And the 2 nights where I did this at unpowered campsites, it only used about 10% battery to run for the entire night. So really not bad at all, as long as there's a real charging station not too far away. A bit more space would have been nice. I basically had most of my stuff sitting on the bed while I was driving during the day, and then I had to shuffle everything to either the front seat or the back seat footwell, or leave it outside, including the cooking stuff. So I would like to maybe bring a little bit less stuff and have the things I do bring a bit more organized to sort of make setting up camp a bit easier. Although having said that, I also think it would have been nice if I'd brought a folding chair. So that's kind of something I want to add to a future trip, to have like some sort of seat or something that I could sit on while camping. Because once I set up camp for the night, there was a giant power bank in the driver's seat that I'm sitting in now. And then I basically couldn't sit down until I went to bed. I kind of just had to stand around, which wasn't a big deal. I just sort of cooked dinner and did footage moving and stuff and then went to bed. But it might have been nice to have a seat at times. Speaking of that giant power bank, my power setup was also something that could probably be improved. While a lot of EVs have something called V2L, where you basically have regular power points in the car that can power anything you want from the car's battery, my car doesn't have that. So to power everything other than the car, I had this 2 kilowatt hour portable power station being charged by a 400 watt flexible solar panel on the roof of the car. And I could maybe make a separate video about this, about how the whole solar setup went, but the solar panel didn't really do what I wanted it to do. It's a 400 watt panel, but the highest I saw it generate was maybe 200 watts. So with the Starlink and the fridge both continuously running, and the occasional charging of other devices, through the majority of the day, on a good day, the solar panel would kind of keep the power bank at around the same state of charge, basically just powering everything, but it wasn't significantly increasing charge in the power bank. So every night when there's obviously no sun, the power bank would significantly drop in charge, and then the solar panel was never really enough to bring it back up to close to full throughout the next day. So I kind of had to top up the power bank at powered sites most nights. I was able to make it work like that, but it was a bit annoying and it didn't really work the way I'd hoped. I do have a few theories as to why the solar panel didn't do the full 400 watts. One possibility is the voltage of the panel might be too low for my power station, so I might need some kind of separate charge controller to boost the voltage to get full power into my power station. So it might be just kind of like a slight incompatibility thing, even though it did work. Another possibility is maybe it was getting too hot sitting directly on the roof. Ideally, it would have some airflow underneath. It did have a lot of airflow on top, so I thought maybe that would be enough. And I couldn't really give it any airflow underneath, because if I tried to have it elevated a bit or something, it would have absolutely destroyed the aerodynamics of the car when I was driving, and very likely caused the car to use more power than the solar would generate, so not really being very helpful then. And another theory I heard in the comments was basically maybe I was scammed. Maybe it's actually a 200 watt panel with a 400 watt sticker on it. Maybe that's true, but I don't think it is. I think maybe there was just something wrong with the setup or something. So I might try a few things and see if I can get 400 watts out of that panel, but it was also really hard to get the panel off the roof. I've taken it off now, and it took basically half a day, and I actually ended up leaving little scratches and dents all over the roof trying to lever it off. So I'm now very reluctant to put it back on the roof for future trips, unless I think it's going to be really, really helpful. So maybe if it gets full 400 watts for most of the day, then I would consider it, if I can get it to start doing that, but I'd still be a bit reluctant even then. I think I would now prefer to find some way of just powering everything from the car, either with some kind of high power alternator charger to charge the power bank continuously at good speeds from the car's power, or just by plugging the power bank into a cigarette lighter port in the car. That standard 12 volt port would provide less power than the fridge and Starlink combined would continuously use, so definitely not ideal to do it that way. But maybe if I can run the fridge and Starlink directly from the car in some other way for most of the day, so the power's not going through the power bank, I could then make that work and use the 100 watts that a 12 volt outlet could give you to just top up the power bank throughout the day to use in the night. Maybe something like that would work. I would just like to be able to only charge the car and have everything else just work on the trip, even if I go several days without staying at a powered site or anything, whether I'm at unpowered sites or staying in motels. I don't want to be carrying power banks into the room or anything. It would be nice if everything could just sort of self-sustain inside the car. I also brought this 3 kilowatt hour power bank, mostly to basically use as an EV jerry can to top up the car if I needed to. I think I can get something like 2.6 kilowatt charging speeds out of this power bank by plugging my 15 amp charger into it. So very slow, but it could theoretically add about 15 kilometers of additional range to the car before the power bank goes flat, even with the terrible efficiency in those extreme conditions. So potentially saving me if I fell short. I used it once on the long stretch between Kununurra and Katherine when I stopped for lunch at a lookout, because there were absolutely no real charges to stop at that day. But it was so hot, I kept the aircon the entire time while I was stopped and charging, and that basically used all the additional charge I added. So frankly, it wasn't very helpful for that and didn't do very much. I didn't really need it then either. I just thought while I'm stopped, it's probably beneficial to get more power, because it was a day when I was obviously not able to charge and kind of struggling for range. And really, I kind of knew this going in, but I really sort of cemented it in my mind throughout the trip. If it looks like you might not make it at any point, you really just slow down. If you're doing 100 and the range estimate says you're still 5 kilometers short of getting to the next charger, just do 90 and then the range will gradually go up. So you just keep checking your range and distance remaining to the charger. Make sure the range is always higher. And if it's not, if you need a bit more buffer, you just slow down a bit more and just keep a decent buffer by dropping the speed as much as you need to. It's not ideal. Ideally, you'd charge it and then be able to do whatever speed you want and everything, but you can make it work more practically than trying to recharge on the side of the highway off a power bank. What I did use that power bank for was actually to top up my other power bank on several occasions when I hadn't been at a powered site and the solar just wasn't cutting it. But with the limited space I had in the car, this thing is so big and heavy, I had to keep it on my bed during the day, and then overnight I had to move it to the driver's seat to be able to sleep in the bed. So most days, twice a day, I was moving the power bank, and I can seriously only just lift it. It's heavy, it's on wheels for a reason, so that wasn't really ideal. So for future trips, I think I would like to leave this power bank behind and just keep my other power bank topped up from the car and make sure I don't run out of charge, so I don't need it. For sort of the value it provided throughout the trip, it was just kind of taking up an unnecessarily large amount of space, and it was kind of annoying. But one thing I found very good was the Starlink Mini, which gave me very decent internet access the entire time. When we first set off, I had it pointing out the rear window, and it did work, but it kind of cut in and out at times, and the suction cups actually kept falling down, so it kept falling off the back windscreen. So after Perth, I moved it and sat it on the dashboard. It was a little bit more in the way there, but it wasn't really a big deal, and it actually worked a lot better. I think having it facing more so upwards, pointing towards the sky, helped it to work properly, and working like that, I used it all the time and it really worked great. Ideally, if I had some sort of a glass roof, like a sunroof type thing, I would suction cup it to that glass roof and have it pointing directly out. Then it'll be less in the way and probably work even better, get even better speeds and everything. But doing this on the dashboard with just a wire running down here, plugged into my power bank to power it, I was able to use it the entire time throughout the trip, and it was really absolutely great. My phone is only on Optus, so I would have no phone reception for sometimes days at a time. With Optus, they don't really even try in the super remote areas because it's just unrealistically difficult, I guess. But thanks to the Starlink, I could, if I wanted to, stop in absolutely the middle of nowhere on the side of the highway somewhere, probably like 100 kilometers from even the nearest Telstra tower, and just stream YouTube in 4K or something. I just had really good internet the entire time, as long as I was within about 10 to 15 meters of the car. It would often struggle if I parked under a tree or just really close to some kind of building or roof or structure or something, because it needs to get a good view of the sky to use satellite internet. But this mostly only happened in town where there would hopefully be phone reception anyway, so it wasn't too big of a deal. It's just a little bit annoying sometimes. If I didn't have a Starlink, I would definitely get a Telstra SIM card. Then I would at least have reception in really all the small remote towns and at quite a lot of the remote roadhouses, and I could have maybe gotten by with that. But I think having a Starlink to always have internet was really good. If nothing else, it meant if I ever did completely run out of charge or break down or get stuck on a dirt road or something in the middle of nowhere with no one around and absolutely no phone reception, as annoying as it would be, I could actually use the Starlink to call a tow truck or something. I really didn't want to need to do that, but it was good peace of mind just knowing I could. It's nowhere near as life or death as it used to be. And it was also great for finding the chargers on PlugShare, looking things up on Google Maps, like where I'm going to go next, how far to this town, etc. Activating chargers at times, checking if the chargers were live according to the charging station app. Some of the off-grid charging stations were in places that I don't think even had Telstra reception. With downloaded maps and some better planning in advance and some RFID cards to activate chargers with no internet and a Telstra SIM to get reception where you can, it would be entirely doable without a Starlink, but I was very glad to have had the Starlink. The ideal setup would have been Telstra SIM and Starlink, but if you're only going to pick one, I would go Starlink with then just Optus or maybe even Vodafone, just whatever you have. And for future trips, I think this is exactly what I'll keep doing. Seeing as I did this huge drive in just 22 days, I didn't really have a lot of time to go on detours and see lots of other things, but I did a few. My grandmother and I detoured about 40 kilometers down a dirt road to see Point St. Clair Pink Lake. It wasn't overly pink at the time. Apparently it changes with algae or something, but it was still pretty spectacular and some fairly unique looking scenery. Even just on the drive there was pretty spectacular. And we obviously stopped at the cliffs on the Great Australian Bight on the Nullarbor, basically right on the highway there. And I went a bit off course to the Lassalin sand dunes and Monkey Mia, however you say it, to try and see some dolphins. Unfortunately, I didn't plan well enough. Apparently, the dolphins usually only come first thing in the morning, so if you really want to see the dolphins, you probably have to spend the night at the resort there or in the nearby town. But it was a beautiful place and a wonderful drive anyway. And to make that detour, I had to charge in Denham, where emus apparently just roam the town, which was also pretty cool. I also detoured to 80 Mile Beach. It was unbearably hot when I was there, just standing there. It was so hot. But a stunning beach, probably would have been very nice in better weather. I did some sightseeing around Broome, and then I was sort of running a bit behind, so I tried to pick up the pace a bit. I did go to Catherine Gorge, but I never actually found the gorge, and then I got too hot and gave up and went back to the car. When I set off on this trip, I kind of had basically every tourist attraction saved on Google Maps, and I thought I'll just keep sort of checking as I go on Google Maps, and I'll just stop by any one of these that I feel like on the way through. If you are going to do something similar, I would say a better strategy would be to certainly just stop at any random place that you feel like along the way, but also pick a few things in advance that you really want to see or do, and maybe do a bit of research and make sure you get there at the right time and you know where you're going and you know roughly how long it's going to take, so you can actually make sure those things actually happen. If I'd done a bit more of that, I might have actually seen the dolphins, and I might have seen Catherine Gorge and a few more things like that. But anyway, even in a short time frame, even not doing many detours, you can actually see a lot of spectacular and very different looking scenery just from the main highway. Just looking out the windscreen while you're driving, or pulling over at a lookout or a rest stop or anything, there's some spectacular different views and everything. And driving through all these remote towns to use the chargers. While I didn't really visit a lot of specific tourist attractions, I still saw a lot of great scenery, and it was really still a great experience. There's some places I'd like to go back to for sure and spend some more time in, but just driving around the main highway itself really was still a wonderful experience. Unfortunately, my cat was sick for the last few days of the trip, so the last couple of days really became about getting home as quickly as possible, and they really weren't super enjoyable, but she's completely fine now. She made a full recovery a few days later, so it all worked out quite okay. It was just a bit of a downer on the end of the trip there, but that's the trip. Overall, I'd say it all went very well. There's a few tweaks I want to make with my setup, and technically a better EV would do the trip better, but I still think I'll keep using my car for more trips in the near future. I still really like it, and the charging network was pretty good. It could use some more chargers in certain places, and I would really like to see reliability improved and just make it a bit more streamlined and easier. And just generally having a lot more chargers around would make it a lot better, but I'm sure that will come with time as there are more EVs on the road. And even in this short time, I really saw a lot of the country and it was great. But for future trips, I would like to do trips that are a bit shorter. It was a long time to be away from home, and I really couldn't have done this trip much faster at all. And if at all possible, I would avoid the tropics in the wet season. I went at that time of year, so it was mostly in March, really all of March, or 22 days, but most of March. I went at that time of year because I hoped the wet season would be mostly over, while still having fairly long days to try and fit more driving into each day. But the wet season certainly wasn't over. The humidity was just way worse than I expected, and it really kind of took away from the experience. Every time I tried to get out of the car, it was just so unpleasantly sweaty. And for the vast majority of the time I was in Queensland, it just was pouring rain with some minor flooding. So I kind of missed out on some things there, just kind of sitting in the car while it was pouring with rain. And in fact, I actually couldn't go to Cairns because they closed the highway due to flooding. So I'm planning to do loads more shorter trips very soon, but I think I'll stay down south until like mid next year when it'll be dry season in the tropics, and then I'll do some more northern trips, and it will hopefully be at least slightly more comfortable. But that's it for this trip. Thanks so much to everyone who's watched along, and there will be some more road trips coming very soon.